I know, I'm not dinner, I'm sorry. Good evening, everyone. My name is Marissa Dukowski. I'm the president of the American University Washington College of Law chapter. I am so excited to be here for my final student convention as a student, hopefully. These past 3 years have really flown by, and I've just been so honored to be a part of this incredible organization. I've been working to ensure that we incorporate diverse programming on under-discussed topics like social justice, applications of consumer protection work, accessibility in telecommunications, and disability. As a person with a physical disability that affects my mobility, disability rights is pretty ingrained in pretty much every area. So I've done a lot of work in healthcare, guardianship, education, consumer protection, reproductive rights, education, you name it. After graduation, I'll be doing a 6-month fellowship at AARP Foundation, and then I'll move on to do a 2-year public interest fellowship dealing with debt collection cases for low-income DC residents with disabilities. Tonight, I am thrilled to introduce our fearless leader, Caroline Fredrickson, and Vincent Michelot, a professor of American politics at Sciences Po Lyon and visiting professor at the University of Virginia. Caroline Fredrickson has served as the ACS president since 2009. Since then, she's published numerous works on so many issues like working women, fair courts, fair elections, other legal and constitutional issues. Prior to her tenure, she served as the director of the ACLU's Washington Legislative Office, General Counsel and Legal Director of NARAL Pro-Choice America, Chief of Staff to Senator Marcia Cantwell, Deputy Chief of Staff to then Senate Democratic Leader Tom Daschle, and Special Assistant to the President for Legislative Affairs during the Clinton administration. Quite a resume. Professor Michelot has authored several essays on the American presidency, a political biography of President John F. Kennedy, and a French textbook on women's rights in the U.S. Supreme Court. He also co-authored a collection of essays surrounding President Barack Obama's first term. He's currently collaborating on an essay in comparative politics on political parties in France and the United States. I can think of no better individuals to lead this discussion, a fireside chat on declining comparative democracy. Caroline and Professor Michelot will compare the imperial presidency and judicial nominations between the United States and France, as well as how these traditions and practices have shaped their respective legislatures and judicial bodies. Without further ado, let's offer a warm bienvenue to Caroline Fredrickson and Professor Vincent Michelot.
Well, it's our version of a fireside. Do what we can. I know we had some hopes to. Oh, the microphone's on. I'm pretty loud. I share a. I'm not sure I need one, but anyway, I'm really thrilled to be here. There we go. See what ACS can do? Pretty great. Okay, so it is fireside, in some way. Thanks everybody for coming. This is an incredibly momentous occasion for me to witness the coming of the next generation of legal leaders, to have a chance to meet you in person. Many of you I've met before or visited you at your law schools, and as you know, I'm always happy to come, so you can invite me if you want to. Otherwise, I'll just come and visit you uninvited. And I'm really pleased to be here with my dear friend Vincent, who is an expert in American politics and French politics. And this is sort of a little bit different than what we often do, but I think being here at the University of Virginia and thinking of Thomas Jefferson, who was a true Francophile and found real friendship in France, and France and the United States were early friends, our first ally, and I have a very personal interest, being that I'm moitié myself. I'm my mother's French, and have a lot of ties to France, and there are just a lot of interesting similarities and differences to talk about, and nobody could be a better a person to have this dialogue with than Vincent, with his expertise. And I want to throw out a couple of issues that I think some of you might have on your mind. For one, I think the gilets jaunes, or the yellow vests, have been a lot in the news. So what's going on in France? Like, what the hell? So how is that, and does that, how does that relate? Is it at all similar to our Tea Party? I mean, the Tea Party is a phenomenon of kind of a popular manifestation of anxiety. And I think, with Richard Cohen talked earlier about how the kind of anxiety that's going on and in the white America. So Vincent, we will start off with talking a little bit about how you see these two movements and what do they reveal about their societies, and how much similarity is there really?
Well, first of all, thanks for the invitation. It's just fantastic because I'm humbled and honored, because the last time I was here at the law school at the University of Virginia was when I was a Fulbright scholar at the University of Virginia, finishing my PhD on, of all things, Supreme Court appointments. And we're in the middle of the Clarence Thomas nomination. So, and I was, looking at the hearings of the past justices. My dissertation was on the process, and especially on the confirmation process from 1937 to 87, and this is where I started. And I also want to pay a tribute or a form of homage. Everything I know about the Supreme Court, I learned, or pretty much everything, from a professor at the UVA Department of Politics, whose name was David O'Brien, who passed away, unfortunately, last December, and who was a fantastic expert in comparative law, comparative politics, but also comparative judicial systems. So, David, I miss you already, and I hope not to be saying anything stupid on the court this afternoon here. Now, you asked me to, compare the two movements. I think they're very different, but at the same time, they have common roots. And one of the roots that I want to point to from the very beginning is that the state of our democracies, both in France and in the United States today, which is declining clearly, for me, largely has to do with the decline of political parties. On either side of the Atlantic, we have establishment parties which no longer can serve their traditional role, and to start with, in the selection of candidates. I would just submit to you that we would not have Donald Trump as a president of the United States had the Republican Party been a party which had had an effective leadership, a set of values, an agenda, and a capacity to do what political parties do first, which is select candidates in order to govern. And that inability resulted in November 8, 2016. On the French side, in the year preceding the 2017 presidential elections, the Socialist Party basically exploded. And at the same time the French Socialist Party was exploding, and today there's a real question of knowing whether there still is a Socialist Party in France. The Conservative Party on the other side was also falling apart. And as a result, we have a new president who founded the party just a year and a half before the elections, and who governs with that party, but without the ability to in any way be able to depend on roots in local government. And what parties also do is articulate local government, local militancy, local activism with national politics, and the articulation also of checks and balances. So this those are, in my opinion, the common points. But we also have strong differences, and I'll just say one word about this, is that for the time being, we do have an electoral system which serves as an efficient gatekeeper against populist movements, which prevents populist movements either from the left or the right from effectively building coalitions. And this, on the other hand, uh, results in such a distortion of the popular vote that the voice of the people, which cannot be heard through elections, shall be heard in different means, and that's the violent protest that we have right now. Whereas I consider the Tea Party movement, for example, as more of a form of internal rebellion within the conservative movement in the United States, not so much the voice of people who'd never been heard or who no longer can be heard. Just one fact, and I'll stop here. Marine Le Pen, the far-right leader, got 22% of the vote in the first round of the French presidential elections. All she has to show for those 22%, that's more than one voter out of 5, is 8 representatives in the National Assembly out of 577. Now, I say it's a great thing, okay, that she doesn't have more than that. But at the same time, consider those people who have consistently voted for the far right. It's 20 or 25%. They never get a mayor elected. They never get a representative in regional councils elected. They shall never get a president elected, and they shall never have a majority in the National Assembly. That's a real problem in representation that we need to address.
Well, so you raised some interesting contrasts, and what makes me think about, as you sort of say, talk about the Tea Party as a rebellion within the Conservative Party versus the Gilets jaunes, which is kind of a diffuse expression of anxiety that can't be channeled into anything. Sort of strikes me that the Tea Party has kind of won its rebellion, and that now they have full representation, and it's Donald Trump. And conversely, Macron is sort of the opposite of the Gilets jaunes. He is the kind of the manifestation of the elite. He went to the fancy school in France, that he worked as a banker. He sort of carries all of the kind of the symbolism of the most elite of France, and so clearly doesn't speak for them at all, but is still incredibly powerful. And you sort of see, I mean, I'm packing a lot into this question, but it's sort of the strength of both presidency, which are incredibly powerful, so that despite having not speaking for very many people in France, and he's very unpopular, he has tremendous power, sort of similar to what the conservatives here think about in the unitary executive and the incredible power the president has already acquired in this country, but they want to give more to. And I don't know how you think about all of these things. It's sort of not really a question as much as just asking you to comment on the kind of the thread here.
Well, I think the interesting thing about the executive branch on either side of the Atlantic is that there is an accrual of power by default. And because the checks and balances on executive power are not functional. In France, we have a judiciary which is less independent, or to put it another way, more dependent on the executive branch. But also, the other point is that parties have traditionally served as a check on the executive branch. This is no longer the case. Emmanuel Macron has a majority of 310 representatives out of 577 in the National Assembly. And in the National Assembly today, we have 72% freshmen. People who had never been elected to the French Parliament. Imagine that 75% of the representatives in the House of Representatives were new. That's what we're having. And in Macron's party, out of 310 people, we have 260 who had never held elective office. Well, the problem is that the only reason why they're in the National Assembly is because there was a photograph of Emmanuel Macron on their campaign poster 4 weeks after the elections. They're incapable of providing a check on the presidency, and especially a presidency which has kept away political parties and by appointing technocrats to the cabinet. So power flows to the executive branch rather than the legislative branch, and then that power has no roots in local government. And the Gilets jaunes, the Yellow Vest movement, would have never taken place had Macron's party, La République En Marche, had a network of mayors who would have told him there's this movement that's surging, literally, and served as an alarm signal as to what was happening in a country that is still extremely centralized. And that has not happened. And the other reason why the Gilets jaunes and the Tea Party are extremely different is because the Gilets jaunes are basically about low-income citizens who live in the exurbs and feel that they have been abandoned by government. And as you all know, in Europe, expectations towards government are much higher in terms of delivering healthcare, in terms of delivering security, because the police, in terms of delivering a postal service, and in terms of delivering education. And those same people who've been abandoned by government to a large degree have also been unable to have their voices heard through elections because they never vote for a candidate who finally gets into office. And at the same time, the government announced on the 1st of January that they would raise the price of diesel fuel. And literally what happened in France is some kind of a Boston Tea Party, but 200 years later or 250 years later, which is no taxation without representation. And they were not represented, and yet they were taxed by that same state that was abandoning them in what you might call the French exurbs, 40, 50 kilometers outside of the cities.
So, well, I could spend all night talking about these things. I wanted to actually change the direction just a little bit before I know we have to, and there are drinks after this, so I'm sensitive to that. The cocktail hour follows. We could just bring them in here and keep talking about La France and La France profonde, because my colleagues know that I love to talk about France all the time. But I think one of the things I find really interesting is when you are an expert on the court systems and on judicial nominations and talk about differences, real differences between the selection process of judges in France versus the United States, where ours is so politicized. But I'm actually also extremely interested in the role of judicial review, because I think for Americans, it's completely hard to grasp different systems where judges can't find laws unconstitutional, except in very rare circumstances. So I understand the French system is moving a little bit more in that direction. Mostly questions of constitutionality are by referral in Europe from the legislature to a constitutional court, not the constitutional court getting litigants in front of it to challenge a law and its application. So can you talk a little bit about that before? And I know there'll be a few questions, and then people want beer or something.
Let me just take one very concrete example. Abortion rights. In France, the debate should be entirely in the parliament. And actually, it is. Except that because that parliament is the result of elections in which voter turnout is lower and lower and lower, then the idea is that judicial review makes more sense. So we're going towards more judicial review. But the courts are not yet as powerful. There's less independence. The terms are shorter. We have in our constitutional court appointments by the President of the Senate, by the President of the National Assembly, and by the President himself, 333. And they're appointed for 9-year terms, which are stacked. And so, for example, just 2 weeks ago, the ex-prime minister, Alain Juppé, a conservative prime minister, was appointed to the Constitutional Council at the sweet age of 72, so he'll serve a 9-year term. But the French Constitutional Court is certainly not one that is going to change the direction of the conversation, for example, on abortion. And I think there's also a movement which is scary to a lot of French people, that it's the European Court of Justice and European courts that are going to take over some of the issues that are presently in front of national jurisdictions.
So I know we are running out of time, which is very painful to me because I could, as I said, stay up here all night. But you do have wine, beer, and et cetera. But we also have a little time for questions. So I think, question. I have to, the microphones. Or not, or just speak up.
Okay, so yes, my name is David Hawthorne. I'm from Northwestern California University School of Law. So this is a real theoretical question. You know, I know that, you know, France have, you know, you got one branch of government strangling the other, and we have that somewhere here. This is sort of philosophical. And at one point, Leader McConnell, when he had stated he was only going to vote the way the president voted, you know, it takes two-thirds in order to ratify the Constitution. It takes 2/3 of the states. So if the leader of the Senate says he's only going to move one way, which is whatever way the president moved, wouldn't that be sort of like the president, you know, controlling the Senate? And if so, this is the question. The question is, this is kind of out of the box thinking. It's very philosophical, but law is philosophical. So could not the state be sued to restrain the representative of the state as sort of them trying to ratify the Constitution indirectly? Since McConnell said that he would only vote that way. Had he not said it, that's one thing. If they moved as a party, that's another. But since he moved,
Can I just say, I think you framed a very, very provocative and interesting question about separation of powers. And, you know, the idea of basically the Senate deferring entirely to the executive branch and everything that it does, in a sense, collapsing it into the executive branch. That's a really interesting idea. I don't know, it's very hard to litigate things like that, but I think it's very provocative to think about what does it do. It certainly poses a lot of questions and challenges our conception of how our government is supposed to function. I think many of us have been very concerned about Congress as a whole, not just the Senate, but also the House, in the past 2 years, not exercising its independence. And a lot of fear about the direction that the judiciary is going in, where we'll similarly lose an ability to have constraints on the executive. So I think what you're suggesting is very right. It's a very appropriate kind of anxiety about the damages that Vincent already talked about, how our democratic system is being undermined. I don't know if you want to comment.
No, just one point is the problem is in litigating such action is that you're talking about words. You're talking about even the leader of the Senate saying something, but it doesn't necessarily follow that everybody in the Senate is going to vote in the same direction, so you don't have real basis, in my opinion, for litigation. However, the question is
but the thing is, he said that he wouldn't, forgive me if I'm going over, please. But this has been troubling me, it really has. But he said that he would only allow a vote to the floor if the president was going to move that direction. So why couldn't the state be sued to restrain their representative from the state from trying to ratify the Constitution indirectly?
Well, as I said, you said you're thinking outside the box. I think it's because these are new ideas. I mean, we haven't had such a subservient Senate leader. I think we have, we're allowed a couple more questions?
We have time for one more question.
One more question.
Maybe a few more.
Ryan gets to decide, I guess. Oh, we have so many people want to ask questions. Could we do a lightning round and have people ask their questions and then we answer?
Yeah, really fast question. Do you think that Macron stands a chance of regaining any sort of faith of the populace, of having a chance? Do you think he's hopelessly out of touch and the administration is going to go out as such?
I'm going to answer real quickly on this one. Macron has another 3 years ahead of him. And he's got ample time to rebound. And also, the other thing is that for the first time in French political history since 1958, we have a majority, but we have 5 different caucuses in the opposition. And none of those caucuses in the opposition can get together. So he might not be very happy where he is right now, but he's actually in a better position than most of the presidents at the same point in the term were, because there's no such thing as even putting together the 3 caucuses that are to his right or the 2 caucuses that are to his left. So it's going to be a victory, but it's going to be a victory by default.
Hi, I'm curious. One of the themes of the French left in the 2017 campaign was their willingness to say that the Fifth Constitution and the Fifth Republic is so de Gaullean and so linked to the center right, and they were calling for the potential of the Sixth Constitution and a renewal of that. Could you give me a sense of your thoughts on that, and how long does the Fifth Constitution have?
I mean, the Fifth Republic is the second longest republic in French history. When I teach American politics to my first-year student, I always start with this lame joke, which is that of a legal scholar walking into a bookstore in Boston and asking for a copy of the French Constitution, and the bookstore owner says, "Sir, we don't do periodicals." And so, the Fifth Republic is the second longest republic after the Third Republic in France. But at a time when we are dealing with the Gilets jaunes movement, which is a profoundly disturbing time for France, at the time when we're facing also a very bizarre but very dangerous coalition in Italy, at a time when the far right is raising its ugly head in Germany, at a time when you have similar parties in Austria, and at a time when you have Viktor Orban in Hungary reinventing the concept of illiberal democracy, and my son lived for 4 years in the Czech Republic, and the Czech Republic is also taking a similar route. There's no appetite right now in France for regime change. And the conversations about the possible advent of the Sixth Republic have such limited interest that we wouldn't even fill an auditorium this size if I wanted to start a debate on the Fifth Republic. I mean, and I'll finish my answer with a form of a quip. How much appetite is there in the United States right now for constitutional reform to, for example, do away with the Electoral College? There's probably appetite for that. But the reality is that going to happen?
Well, actually, Vincent, if I could just jump in, I think where our real anxiety is with a constitutional convention. Discrete amendments that could be done, and there's actually a very interesting idea about how to reform the Electoral College without actually amending the Constitution. We could talk about that over dinner. But a constitutional convention does give us enormous anxiety for that exact reason, is that it's sort of like what would come out of that process at this current time.
But one point that I want to add is that right now, the really interesting thing in France is a debate about the electoral system. Because on the one hand, the present system is an excellent gatekeeper. And, I was a visiting professor here in the spring of 2017 during the French presidential campaign. And the Washington Post and New York Times were already writing that Marine Le Pen was our next president. And sorry, stupid. This was not going to happen. This was like some kind of a scarecrow, because it's strictly impossible right now for the far right in France to gain any kind of majority in any kind of election which does not have proportional representation. And the only proportional representation election that we have are European elections. Okay? So we have that system, first past the post, 2 rounds in municipal, regional, parliamentary, and presidential elections. That's great. Except that it excludes basically 40 to 45% of French voters from any access to power in terms of electing someone who is going to effectively exercise power. So we go.
I was going to say, Vincent, but that doesn't look so bad to Americans right now.
No, it's true. It's true. So the idea is to reform the system in order to introduce some kind of proportional representation, so that there is a feeling that you do not completely disconnect people from the vote, or from the idea that there is value in voting. And okay, again, I mean, when you compare the 2 countries, we bemoan and regret and cry over the fact that the turnout in the second round of the presidential elections was the lowest since the 1969 elections. It was still at 74.8%. So of registered voters. So that's pretty high, knowing that 98% of French eligible voters are actually registered to vote. So it's a high turnout. But if you disconnect people from the right to vote, if there's not some amount of proportional representation, you get what we're having right now, which is a protest in which all the norms of democracy are broken. I just want to point to something else which is very important. There's a 72% increase in anti-Semitic acts in France. There has been in the last year. In that Gilets jaunes movement, we've seen people deface the Arc de Triomphe, which is the monument to fallen soldiers, and there is a form of disinhibition or liberation of speech, which goes well beyond whatever you might want to call a robust democratic debate.
Well, on that note, can you join me in thanking Vincent for participating?